Hey everyone, Sean Frangella here for PremiumBeat.com with a new Cinema 4D tutorial about how to create and model this street lamp model from scratch, all in Cinema 4D. So if we take a look at my Cinema 4D file of this, we got a basic camera move and some lights, sliders, scene. And the main thing I want to go over is how to build this from scratch. So if we look at this model, we have some nice details using all sorts of different modeling techniques. We have some bolts on this base and some street signs and some different hard surface techniques to create this top part. So let's get into building this. It'll be a good coverage of lots of different ways to model these sorts of industrial objects that you might find out in a city. So I'll just make a new file new, and I have kind of a basic reference photo to use for this, but we'll kind of make it up as we go because it's good to be creative with this sort of stuff. So to get a photo that I brought in on my front view, I'll click right here and then press Option V to get my viewport display, and I'll make sure I'm in back, and then I can click the ellipse and get this reference photo that I found, and this is fine. We'll just kind of use this for scale, and that's really about it. So I'll open that up, look in my front view, and I'll scale this up a bit, turn the transparency up, and offset it to where it's in the center of my scene on the Y. And again, I'm just using this kind of for scale. So if we look at a cube, we kind of want a decent amount of scale related to the size that objects come in Cinema 4D. So I'll just scale this up a bit more, just so when we make a cube, it doesn't end up being huge. And on that note, we'll start kind of with a base and then use some different techniques to build these posts and wires, and even throw some street signs and get the lamp out there. So let's start with a cube for the base, and I'll just use this kind of to block this out. And on my cube, I'm going to just scale it in a bit, and I'm going to, on it, under object, add fillet cap so it's rounded, but we don't want it that rounded. We just want a little bevel, so I'll go to just something like 5, and that'll kind of be our starting point. And I'll go to display lines. We can see our geometry. Now if we look at my original file, the idea that I had in mind is we could have this base that kind of tapers in with some bolts and then this post coming out of it. So let's go for that. What we're going to do to build that is I'll throw on a taper deformer onto our cube. So I'll go up here under deformers and I'll grab taper, and then I can make that a child of the cube. And rather than try and move it into place, I can click this fit to parent, and that'll snap it. And what taper is going to do is it'll taper the top or bulge it out. And what I want to do is just taper it a little, so I'll go like 30. And I don't want that curvature because I don't want it to look cartoony, so I'll take curvature down, and that'll give me that taper without it kind of curving out. Now what I want to do is create some repeating bolts around this. So I'm going to just make a bolt out of an end side right here under our spline objects, and I'll make that XZ. And then I'm just going to move this and scale it down, and then I'm going to extrude this. And we could build this a number of ways. I just want to create kind of a basic bolt shape, so I'm going to drop an extrude in here and then drop in that end side, and that's going to extrude it. But by default, because I had this going up, it's going to not do it on the right plane. So I want to go to my extrude and actually take off 20 on Z, so it's XYZ, and I want to extrude up in this case. And I could have done it either way, but this is fine. I'll just go to like 5, and then I want some edges again because we want some nice bevels if we're doing hard surface stuff to catch some light. So I'll go to fillet cap, but then I'll take the radius down to like 1 on each side. So we just get a nice little bolt that we could figure as keeping this whole thing together. And it looks like my anchor point is kind of out of whack, which happens pretty frequently, and we can fix that if we go to mesh, axis center, and then click include children and use all objects, and I'll execute. And I'll just leave this up because I'll probably use this another 20 times. So what I want to do is have a bunch of these on the fronts and sides, and rather than creating a bunch of copies, what we can do is put it in a cloner. So I'm going to go to MoGraph cloner, and I'll drop this in and call it bolt and pull this up. And if I pull this cloner out here, it's going to repeat But what I want to do is on the cloner, go to grid array, and that's going to be way too many. So I can go to 2, 1, 2 on the count, and that's going to give me a grid of 4, and then I can just scale the size down. Now what I want to do is I'll start with these on the top, so I'm just going to move this whole cloner into place. And why it's nice using this cloner is rather than having a bunch of copies, I can just scale it out from this size of this cloner. And that's going to keep it geometrically exact, and I can just move the whole cloner object back to our center point, which is going to help a lot. As we're building this from the center, everything is going to stay in place, and then I can just scale my original bolt down and just go back to the cloner and scale the cloner size up, and they're going to keep in the same spot. And I'll just put this on the top here, and we could do some stuff to constrain it, but it's really not necessary for this. And then what I'll do is call this bolt clones, and I'll make an instance of this whole cloner. So I'll go up here and go to instance. And that's going to instance and make a copy of my whole clone. And then I can move and rotate one onto the front. So I'll just move the whole cloner object and just rotate it into place. And I can switch the axis by pressing W, so I know that I want it on the cloner axis, and then I can just slide this up and it's going to follow along the edges here. And I can just snap it into place, and I'll make another copy of that, press W, and then move it over here and just rotate it again. And I can use my grid lines to make sure those are lined up consistently. And then I have some nice extra details on this block, and I can just take the whole thing now and put it in a group with Option G and call this base. And then we have some nice extra parts without having to worry about losing track of anything, as well as keeping everything easy to update if we just have one bolt that we want to change, and it's going to update all of them if I ever need to make a change. Now I want to build this post out, but I don't want to have to build a bunch of different parts to get kind of this little stuff. So what we're going to do for that part is we're going to create it with a Bezier spline and then drop it into a lathe, and it's going to wrap it around. So we'll just draw one little slice of it and then let the lathe do the rest of the work. So what I'm going to do to get that started is I'll create a point beneath kind of the base, and these arrows are kind of in the way, so I can get rid of those with Option D. And I'm going to draw a point to the right, and then I'll just draw out one little slice from the center and get a nice curve there, and then pan up, and I can get a little bit of curvature since it is a tall object, and it kind of tapers in a bit. So we can see we're getting a little bit, which is good. And then I can just draw kind of this cap out and get some nice extra detail in this top part by having a little top cap on it that kind of curves around, and then I'll have it go up here and even create a little tiny top cap on the top. And what I want to make sure of with this is I grab the top and bottom points, and down here make sure that on X they're exactly at 0, because what this is going to do is wrap it around the Y axis. So we want to make sure those points are exactly at 0, and it's going to make it function correctly. So I'll just zoom out, and if we look in our perspective view, it's just a line, but what we can do is drop it into a lathe. So the spline becomes a child of this lathe. And then it's going to wrap it around 360 degrees, and we get this nice object. And what's nice about this technique is we can always go back in and add more detail. So now I kind of want more down here. I don't just want it dropping straight in here. So now what we can do is get into any of our views. So I'll just go in my right view, and we can always turn off the lathe and go back into my spline. And I probably want it from the front so I don't just see just a line. So I'll go here in the front, and we can always add more points and delete and curve stuff around, really similar to working in Illustrator. So what we can do is on the spline, I'll go to point mode, and I need to add some points. So I can just right click on the line and go to create points, and I could also use the knife tool and cut. And then I'm just going to create a couple more points, and then I can, with the live selection, grab some of these and turn that off again with Option D, and just move them over and create some nice little extra geometry. And we can add curves to this because we don't want it to be so chiseled. So I can do the same thing that I would probably do in Illustrator, is right click on this and I can go to soft interpolation, and then I can edit these curves when I'm on the move tool. So I can bend my Bezier curves around, and I can also just change one by holding shift while moving that curve, and that'll allow me to move just one end of it. So maybe I'll pull this out a little, and I'll do the same thing with this one. Soft interpolation, and then I can just tighten that curve up as I want to and change one by holding shift. And I can go back up and make sure I have the type of curves that I want and kind of work this a little more. So now I probably want to edit this curve a bit and maybe add 1 point here so that I can select this one and kind of have it smooth out a bit. And it's a really good way to kind of keep things simple and be able to edit it later. So then I'll just go back into model mode, turn back on my lathe, and then I have my whole base, and I've added some extra geometry, and my bolts are lining up nicely. Now, what I want to do next, if we look at our model, is create some street signs and our little bolted on sign that could be like our parking, or that could be like our parking hours, and just create some extra parts in it. So for those ones, what I'm going to do is for the base, I'll grab a tube, and this is going to give me a tube with an inner and outer radius. So this will work well for this, and I can grab this tube and under object. If I zoom in, I can pull the inner radius really close, but not intersecting. So I want enough to where it looks like it's kind of bolted on, but there's a little bit of space. And then outer radius, I can pull in almost as far as maybe like 25 or even a little more, so it looks like it has some depth. And then I can turn on fillet caps for that, similar to the cube, and I'll turn it down in segments because I don't need that many. And for radius, maybe like 0.25 because I just want a little bevel. And then I can change the height and just scale this down. And then we can see it's a little rough, so under rotation segments, I could just turn that up and double it, so 72. It's going to give me more rounded geometry. And then what I'll do for the sign is I'll grab another cube, and I can just do that same thing that I did for the base of scale it down and kind of line it up and scale it with these little orange circles, which is nice to start out with. And look at my different views and just slide this into place so it looks like it's hanging on that little ring. So let's pull that in. And then on this, I could add caps too, so it looks a little beveled. So again, by default, it's going to be way too rounded, but I can make it really small bevel, so like 0.5, and maybe even scale this in just so it looks like a little bit of a metal sign, but not really thick. And then again, just to keep things clean and have reusable parts, what I can do is I already have a bolt down here in this cloner, and I have instances of that cloner. What I can do is just make an instance of this original bolt. So I'll grab an instance, and now that's instancing off of the bolt that was in that cloner object. So it's a single bolt, but if I ever went back and changed this original bolt, that one's going to scale with it. And again, this is useful to keep in mind of just building things modularly and making things easier. And if we figure these were all bolts from the same store or company, they'd probably look the same. So we could just line that up on the front of the sign so it looks like it's, even though it's a 3D model, it's still actually built and there's stuff holding it on. And then I can make a copy of that one by holding Command. And that's just going to make another instance, which again is good because it's still linked to that original bolt. And then I can just grab all of these parts and put them in a group using Option G. And I'll call this sign. And now I have this little group that's this ring, this front sign, and these bolts. And this is good because I could copy this whole thing. So not instance, but just make a copy and use this to make my little street sign. So I'll pull this one up and figure the street signs are hanging above it. And I'll get rid of these bolts because they're going to be too big. And then I can just take my cube and move it over. And this is why it's good that we're building everything straight on the origin point of Cinema 4D, because I can see very clearly and line this up to get it exactly on the side. And then I'm going to need to scale this down, obviously. So if it was a street sign, it'd be like this. And we could do the same thing with the ring. Let's take that ring and make it half the size, so 9. And then we can just line up in our side views this little street sign hanging off and get that right in the center, and extra little details that really only took, a minute to do. And then again, just thinking of our clean working methods of instancing and groups, we have this street sign. Rather than have a bunch of copies and have to update both, if you want to update it, what we can do is we'll call this street sign. And right now the rotation point is kind of in the middle of nowhere, but I can move that to the center of my scene, which is going to be the center of this circle since we built that tube right there. So if I grab my enable axis and press L, I can move that to exactly the center and then turn this off. And now if I rotate this, it's going to rotate around. So what I can do is grab this street sign, make an instance, and I can just move that one up and rotate that exactly 90 degrees. And now we have little street signs on the top of this that we know are exactly 90 degrees. So if this was an actual light post with street signs on a city grid, we know that these aren't just randomly thrown at angles, it's actually 90. So we're getting some good nice detail. Let's keep going. Let's build these top little pieces, and let's build these in a good way too. So let's have kind of these metal tubes, but let's have it taper at the edges if we want to. So what I'm going to do for that is, rather than any of these methods so far, I'm going to grab another Bezier curve, and I'm just going to draw out a line of where this is, so it cuts into this head parts and then ends up in our main base. And then that's all I need is that one line. And what I'm going to do is grab a circle, and we'll drop this into a sweep. So there's a circle down here, and we'll then grab a sweep, and we can sweep this circle around this spline by making it a child. So the circle, then the spline, and by default it's going to be huge because it's going to be as big as that circle. So we can, in our sweep, scale that circle down by pressing T, and now we can see it's scaling. And what's nice about this sweep is because we can do really gradual changes in this. If we go to the sweep and go to object, there's end scale and start scale. So if we turn the circle pretty small, we can scale our circle way down, so maybe it gets smaller here. And then in our sweep, we could have end scale be bigger, so 200. And then we know from point A to point B, it's gradually scaling 100 to 200 evenly. And then if we look up close, again, we're not getting enough geometry on this either. So to fix that and have more subdivisions, what we actually want to do is go to the spline, and we'll turn down the angle to 0. And you can see as we turn this up or down, it's adding more segments, so we're getting more curvature. And again, nice, easy, functional way to build that. Now let's build another one. And again, thinking about how to do this in a smart way, we already built one. All we need to do is have another line and have it straight. So I'll copy this whole sweep, and I could call this top rail. So I'll hold Command and make a copy. And all I really need to do is take this spline, if I turn off my rail and my circle, and I'll just turn off the other one for now. Now all I need to do is move this down, go into point mode, and I can move over this one point. And I don't even have to worry about that curve not working out because I can do the same thing I did before. Just press Option D to turn those off. And then I'll grab both points, right click, hard interpolation, and that's going to cut out the curvature. And I can just move this second point back into place. And now if I turn it back on, we're getting the same sort of rail that's going from 100 to 200. And we saved ourselves some times with having to make another sweep and circle, and we can really just copy over the parts. And I can call this bottom rail. So the last part to build is the main head and a light coming out of it. And that's not as straightforward and modular as these other shapes, and that's why I saved it for last. So we can build that using a little more complex polygonal modeling techniques and kind of bend things around too. So for that one, rather than starting with vector shapes, I'm just going to grab a cube, and I'll move that up into place, and that can kind of just be my basic block for this. And I'll just scale it down and kind of roughly into place to be kind of the base of where I would want this. And I can look at it from in here and kind of get a base of really the shape, and then cut into this cube and kind of mold it for the geometry. And then on my cube, to get a little bit of geometry to pull apart, I'm going to change XYZ segments to 2 by 2 by 2. And then on my cube, I'm going to make that editable by pressing C. And then I can grab the points, lines, and edges and kind of mold this around. So what I want to do first is kind of block out this back part. So I'm going to go to edge mode and press UL, and I'll get this back edge. I can go to edge mode and press UL, and I'll grab this whole back loop because UL will give us our loop selection. And then I'll scale this down. And then I'm going to go to point mode, and the quickest way to grab these back edges is if I go to my marquee selection. It'll let me grab things, but if I do it by default, it's just going to grab what I can see. So on my rectangle marquee selection, I want to uncheck only select visible. And then if I grab it, it's going to select all the points, and I can scale those down a little further and move that up. And I want to do the same thing with the front, and I might need one extra line. So how I can add that in, because I don't want to just grab these and scale it all, because then it's going to be kind of too pointy. I would kind of want it constrained a bit. So I'm going to go to polygon mode, grab everything, and then I can press K for knife. And again, this is a tool that by default, it's not going to do what I want, but on the knife property, so I press K, I want to change mode to loop. And then I can draw a loop and just click, and it's going to make another cut. So that's a really quick way to add a little bit more geometry without adding a bunch of subdivisions. And then I can do the same thing, grab point mode, select all those front ones, scale this down and move it up a bit, and maybe even grab all of these and pull it out a bit. And then I can grab just these 2 points, because that's going to grab both sides, and then I can scale those and kind of bulge it out a bit, and then grab the bottom ones and maybe pull them up a little bit. And this is just kind of blocking it out. So now that we kind of have a rough idea of what this shape could be, what we can do is drop it into subdivision surface up here. So I'll grab that and drop that cube in, and it's going to smooth out all the edges of that. But by default, it's kind of way too smooth and bubbly, and that's not completely what I want. But what I can do is go back to our shape and go to edges, and we can see that we can still grab those. So if we are on edges, points, or polygons, we have our shape and it's in our subdivision surface, which we can turn on and off. And we can still edit it as well as shift the amount that it's filling this box and crease the edges. So if I go to my lines and press UL for loop again, I can grab the top, the bottom, the front, and the back. And then if I turn back on the subdivision surface, so I have those selected now, if I hold the period key on the main keyboard and then drag left or right, I can basically shift the amount of that box that they're filling. So if it's all the way to the left, it's more bubbly. All the way to the right, it's completely filled. So if I go all the way to the right and then just pull it back a little, we'll get a nice smooth shape, but still get those nice bevels. So then if I go to model mode, we can see that we have our shape and it's smooth. If we go to subdivision surface, we could turn it up a little, but it still looks like it's metal material and still has clear edges. So that's a good way to make kind of this not as straightforward shape, and another good modeling workflow tip. Now, to build a little lantern in there, we could use another object. We'll use a loft and connect some circles and keep that one kind of simple. So we'll go to our tools and grab a circle, and I'll put that on plane ZY, and I can look at my views and just kind of move and scale that, looking at the top, and get it into place where it would be sitting below this. And then I can just move it into place, and from my right view, move it to the top. And what I'm going to do with this is I'll put it where the bottom of the light is, and then I'll hold command and drag and let go of the mouse to make a copy, scale that one up a bit with T, and then I'll grab a loft and put them both in there. And what this is going to do is connect those circles. And again, it looked like the anchor point moved, so I could just do execute. And now I can put this in here and use this top one to go into the object, the bottom one to kind of be this bigger lantern, and just scale and move them into place. And then if I make more copies by holding command and drag down and get the left arrow, I can then move and scale those to kind of bow this in so that it just doesn't look just like basic geometry. And I'll grab one there and then make one more copy and pull it up just on Y and scale it just a little in So then we get some nice curvature. And on this loft, we can do similar stuff with subdivisions like the other one. So we'll just double that. And then we get a nice little light that looks like it's cutting out, and we could always tuck it further in and make further changes. And again, just to kind of think about how this would actually be machined and add extra little details, if we turn on in our renderer physical and ambient occlusion, we can see that this geometry is just cutting straight into there. So if we want to make it look like it's sunken, one little thing we could do is just rename this lamp, and I'll rename our subdivision surface lamp head. I can create a little cut around this that looks like it's exactly cut out of the head in this shape. So what I'm going to do is duplicate the lamp by holding Command, and I'll call this cut, and I'll scale it up just a bit bigger than the lamp, and then I can grab a bool object and I'll drag the cut in and then the lamp, and what that's going to do is cut this cut loft out of this lamp. So if I scale that up more, you can see that it's actually cutting there. So what I can do is just zoom in real close and just make this barely bigger than the lamp. And then if I do a render, because I have ambient occlusion on, even without lights, we can see a little bit of those details where light can't get to, and it'll be a nice little detail without adding too much geometry to add some extra little insets to this. So there we go. There's our street lamp. It was a lot of good little topics of different ways to do stuff. We covered using instances and lots of different techniques for working smarter with modeling, keeping everything clean, as well as using loft, sweeps, lathe, and even polygonal modeling to make this in a more complex shape. So this has been Sean Frangella teaching you how to model this 3D light post model from scratch. Be sure to stop by premiumbeat.com for all your music and sound effects needs, and check out the blog on premiumbeat.com for tips and tricks on Cinema 4D, After Effects, and other animation applications. And if you want to see more of what I do, you can check out my website at seanfrangella.com and subscribe on youtube.com/seanfrangella. And as always, thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to all Premium Beat channels on YouTube and Vimeo to get more animation tutorials. And I will see you at the next video.